I'm about to share with you a story that's been shrouded in mystery for almost 3 decades. On July 18, 1997, the body of 25-year-old Megan Louise Rose was discovered at the base of the Point Cartwright Cliffs in Mooloolaba, Queensland, Australia. The waves crashed beneath her, as if the ocean itself held its breath, watching as authorities were left to piece together the unsettling details surrounding her death. At first, it seemed like a tragic accident, perhaps even something more tragic than we could comprehend at the time. The initial conclusion? Suicide. It was an easy answer, but something didn't sit right with Megan's family. They never believed that she had ended her life that way, and after years of unanswered questions, their belief would eventually prove to be more than just a gut feeling. Flash forward to 2022. Megan's case is reopened by the Queensland Police's Cold Case Unit. For years, the truth had been hiding in the shadows, but now, the dim light of new evidence began to pierce through. The investigation, dormant for so long, reignites. It's only then that the real story begins to unfold, a story that no one could have anticipated. Then, on January 2nd, 2025, the unimaginable happens. 72-year-old Keith Lees, her former partner, is arrested for her murder. A man who had evaded capture for nearly 18 months, living under a false identity, relying on the unsuspecting support of religious groups who had no idea who he truly was. His arrest was the breakthrough the family had waited for. The moment they could finally start to make sense of their loss. But what really happened that day in 1997? Why did it take so long for the truth to come to light? As we dig deeper into the investigation, into the background of Megan and her relationship with Keith, and into the twisted web of lies and deceit that would lead to this shocking arrest, I want to hear your thoughts. Share them with me in the comments section below. Was the original verdict of suicide a mistake? And what will the future hold for Keith Lees as the case progresses? Stick with me, because this story is only beginning. To truly understand the gravity of what happened to Megan Louise Rose, we must first go back to the person she was before her life was tragically cut short. Megan was a woman full of promise, a woman who had dreams and ambitions just like anyone else. She was born in 1972 in Australia, growing up with a sense of independence and compassion that would define her as she matured. From a young age, she felt a deep connection to helping others. This drive led her to pursue a career as a disability and aged care nursing assistant, a field where her empathy and nurturing spirit could truly shine. Megan's choice to enter this field wasn't an accident. It reflected the core of who she was. Those who knew her described her as someone who genuinely cared for others, always going the extra mile to make sure people were taken care of, no matter the circumstances. She worked tirelessly at her jobs, not for the recognition, but for the satisfaction that came from knowing she made a difference in people's lives. She spent her days at the Blue Nurses in Marcola, providing care and support to those in need, and at the Coolum Nursing Home, where she made lasting connections with residents and colleagues alike. But it wasn't just work that defined Megan. She was also someone who valued her relationships with family and friends. She had a close-knit circle of people who adored her, people who loved her unconditionally. Her family, in particular, was always there to support her, and she often turned to them when things weren't going well. It was evident in the way she spoke about her parents, her siblings, and her closest friends. She was fiercely loyal and protective of the people she cared about. Her relationship with Keith Lees, however, was one that many of those closest to her couldn't quite understand. In 1996, Megan made the decision to move to the Sunshine Coast with Keith. He was 47 years older than her, a significant age gap that raised eyebrows among those who knew them. Keith was a man of few words, an enigma to those around him. On the surface, he seemed kind, but his demeanor was often distant. Megan, on the other hand, was lively, optimistic, and always eager to experience life. Friends and family members saw her relationship with Keith as somewhat unusual, even concerning at times, but Megan seemed committed to him, and they went on to live together. Despite the oddity of their age difference, Megan's life in the Sunshine Coast seemed to be flourishing in many ways. She found work at Blue Nurses in Marcola and continued her career as a disability and aged care nursing assistant, a job that fulfilled her. Megan loved the Sunshine Coast. It was a peaceful place to live, a place where she could focus on her work and her life with Keith. Still, there were whispers among her colleagues and friends. They had noticed how Keith would often be possessive of her and would isolate her from the people who cared about her. But Megan was always the optimist, believing in the best of people, and she thought things would eventually improve. Megan's personality was magnetic. People gravitated to her. She had an infectious energy that made those around her feel valued and heard. Her aspirations were simple, yet powerful: to continue helping others, to find happiness, and to build a future with Keith, despite the challenges that seemed to exist in their relationship. She was someone who believed in love, and in her mind, Keith was the person she wanted to spend her life with. But as much as she loved her work and had a clear sense of purpose, there was a part of her that struggled. The reality of her relationship with Keith was difficult to ignore. Those who had witnessed the dynamics between them often spoke of her isolation. She had become increasingly withdrawn from her family and friends, perhaps out of a desire to maintain peace in her relationship. But over time, the cracks began to show. Small hints of tension between Megan and Keith that those around her couldn't help but notice. And while no one could have predicted the devastating outcome, there were signs, subtle and perhaps ignored, that pointed to a relationship with a darker side. But what went wrong? What drove Megan to her untimely death? And why was her tragic end initially deemed a suicide? Could it have been something far more insidious? The answer, as we now know, was buried in the details of her life, in the relationship she shared with Keith, and in the quiet moments that no one else could hear. What do you think? Was there something about her relationship with Keith that foreshadowed the tragedy to come? Could her death have been prevented? I want to hear your thoughts. Please share them with me in the comments below. Stay tuned, because the story doesn't end here. The day Megan Rose's life came to a tragic end began like any other, at least on the surface. But something was different, something that would ultimately leave a hole in the hearts of those who loved her. The events leading up to that fateful moment on July 18, 1997, are shrouded in mystery, with details that never quite added up. On that day, Megan had made plans to meet up with her family. She was close to them, and they were looking forward to spending time together. But those plans were never realized. Instead, Megan's final moments were marked by a solitary walk to the top of Point Cartwright Cliffs, a place she had come to know, a place where the calm of the sea met the rugged landscape of the coast. What happened during her last hours is unclear. But by the time her body was discovered at the base of the cliffs, all that remained was a haunting silence. Her family and friends were left with more questions than answers. Had she truly taken her own life? Or had something darker transpired, hidden beneath the surface of what was seen on the outside? When Megan's body was found, it was immediately clear that the scene at Point Cartwright had the markings of a tragic end. Authorities quickly arrived, and an investigation was launched. But the initial conclusion was as swift as it was devastating. The death was ruled a suicide. Authorities pointed to the possibility of Megan having climbed to the edge of the cliffs, overcome by a moment of despair, before leaping into the unknown below. But even with this official ruling, there were those who couldn't shake the feeling that the story didn't match the woman they had known. Megan wasn't someone who had shown signs of deep despair, at least not in a way that would lead to such a drastic final act. The idea of her walking alone to that cliff, standing on the edge, and making the choice to end her life didn't resonate with the people who had seen her just days before. They began to question everything. Why hadn't she reached out for help if she was struggling? Why was there no warning, no indication that something was amiss? Her family had heard nothing from her that day, nothing to suggest she was in emotional distress. And so, as the authorities closed the case, the family was left in the dark, grasping at the lingering suspicion that something was being overlooked. Point Cartwright itself, a landmark with a rich history, loomed over the case. The cliffs were more than just a beautiful backdrop for the coast. They had witnessed countless stories, seen lives come and go, but they had also seen tragedy. The Point Cartwright Lighthouse, a towering presence that had stood since 1968, cast its long shadow over the area, its light guiding ships away from the rocky coast. The lighthouse was symbolic in more ways than one. Its beam a protector against the dangers of the sea, a beacon that had seen many lives, many lost. The cliffs themselves were a natural wonder, offering a breathtaking view of the surrounding coastline. But for those who knew the area, Point Cartwright was more than just a tourist spot. It was a place where people came to reflect, to find peace, or perhaps to hide. It was a place that had witnessed its fair share of darkness, even if it was veiled beneath its scenic beauty. For Megan, Point Cartwright may have been just another place to visit, a quiet spot away from the noise of everyday life. But for her family, it became a site of unanswered questions. Why had she been there alone? Why hadn't she contacted anyone before her death? There were too many unanswered questions, too many inconsistencies. And so, despite the ruling of suicide, Megan's family refused to let go of their doubts. They pushed for answers, questioning whether the death had truly been a result of her own hand. Was it possible that something or someone had played a part in her fall? Her family believed there was more to the story, something buried beneath the surface that no one had yet uncovered. As time passed, the case became one more cold file, gathering dust in the archives of unsolved mysteries. But in the hearts of those who knew her, Megan's story never truly ended. They kept searching for answers, refusing to accept the conclusion that had been placed upon her death. They knew deep down that the truth was out there, hidden, waiting to be discovered. What do you think happened that day at Point Cartwright? Was it truly a suicide, or was something else at play? I want to know your thoughts. Was Megan's death part of a larger, more twisted story than anyone realized? Share your ideas with me in the comments below. Stay tuned as we dive deeper into the investigation and the shocking turn of events that would eventually lead to the truth. The case of Megan Louise Rose had been closed for years, yet it lingered in the minds of those who had never quite accepted the ruling of suicide. For her family, the truth felt just out of reach, a truth that they believed could only come to light if the investigation was given a second look. And so, after years of frustration and unanswered questions, the Cold Case Unit of the Queensland Police took a dramatic step forward. In 2022, the case was reopened, an event that would change everything. But why did it take so long for the investigation to restart? What was the catalyst that prompted authorities to re-examine the case after 25 years of dormancy? It wasn't a sudden burst of new information, but rather a combination of factors: new evidence, the tireless persistence of Megan's family, and the undeniable advancement of forensic technology. While the original investigation had failed to uncover critical details, the passing of time had allowed for fresh perspectives, new technologies, and a willingness to take another look at an unsolved mystery that had never quite sat right with the community. One of the driving forces behind the reopening of the case was the increasing public pressure. Megan's family had never given up hope. They had always believed in the possibility that her death wasn't what it seemed. Over the years, they pushed for further investigation, constantly calling attention to the gaps in the evidence and the inconsistencies in the original investigation. They were relentless in their pursuit of the truth, and their voices were finally being heard. But the reinvestigation wasn't just about keeping the memory of Megan alive. It was about uncovering the truth, about finding justice for a woman whose life was cut short far too soon. The Queensland Police, recognizing the merit in the family's efforts, took action. They reopened the case, and for the first time in decades, new resources were dedicated to finding answers. So, what was it that finally gave the investigation the spark it needed? New forensic evidence played a pivotal role. Advances in forensic technology allowed investigators to re-examine old pieces of evidence with a fresh set of eyes, providing crucial new information that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. DNA testing and other modern techniques helped authorities uncover new leads that were previously invisible. But beyond that, a breakthrough came in the form of testimony from new witnesses who had never been interviewed before. These were people who had known Megan, had worked with her, or had been close to her in some capacity. People who were now willing to come forward with information that, for one reason or another, had never been shared before. As the investigation reopened, the Queensland Police also sought the public's help in solving the mystery. A $500,000 reward was offered, a powerful incentive that encouraged people to come forward with any information, no matter how small it might have seemed. The power of this reward cannot be underestimated. It served as both a motivator for those with information and a symbol of the community's commitment to justice. The police knew that in order to crack this case, they would need the help of the public. And so, through strategic appeals to the community, more leads began to emerge. The media campaign surrounding the case also brought the story back into the public eye, casting a new spotlight on Megan's death. Television interviews, press releases, and articles all helped push the case into the limelight once again. Public appeals to jog memories and inspire fresh tips became key tools in the investigation's reinvigoration. And as the pieces started to fall into place, it became increasingly clear that there was more to Megan's death than originally believed. There were discrepancies that no longer made sense in the context of a suicide. The timeline didn't add up. Certain witnesses had come forward with information that pointed to foul play. And perhaps most chilling of all, new evidence suggested that someone with knowledge of the crime had actively worked to keep the investigation from progressing. But even with these new leads, there were still countless questions that needed to be answered. What had truly happened to Megan on the day of her death? How had Keith Lees, her former partner, managed to evade authorities for so long? And what role had he played in this dark mystery? As the investigation continued to unfold, it became increasingly clear that this was no ordinary case. Megan's death had left scars that had never fully healed, and now finally, the pursuit of justice had begun again in earnest. The reopening of the case was just the beginning. I want to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think the new evidence and fresh leads could finally bring justice for Megan? And what do you make of the role the public played in reopening the investigation? Was the $500,000 reward enough to motivate those who knew the truth to come forward? For almost 2 years, Keith Lees evaded capture, living in the shadows hidden from the law. His name was now synonymous with mystery, his whereabouts a subject of intense speculation. But on January 2nd, 2025, the veil of secrecy surrounding him was finally pierced. After 18 months on the run, Keith Lees was arrested, and the truth of what had been happening during those long months began to come to light. Lees, a 72-year-old man, had been living under a false identity, fooling those around him into believing he was someone he was not. It was almost as if he had vanished from existence, slipping through the cracks of the system. His arrest, which took place after an extensive manhunt, marked a pivotal moment in the long, torturous quest for justice in the case of Megan Louise Rose's death. How had Lees managed to evade capture for so long? How had he disappeared without a trace? The answer lay in the skill with which he crafted his new identity and the surprising support he had received during his time on the run. Keith Lees had cleverly assumed a false identity that allowed him to blend into the fabric of society without raising suspicion. He had managed to escape detection by using forged documents and assuming the persona of a man no one would recognize. His new life was meticulously constructed, and for the most part it worked. He had found a way to stay off the radar until the pressure finally became too much. But even more shocking than his ability to hide was the fact that he had found sanctuary in unlikely places. Lees had received assistance from certain religious groups who, unaware of his true identity, offered him shelter and support. These groups believed they were aiding someone in need, unaware that they were harboring a man with a dark past, a man wanted for the murder of his former partner. For them, his story was a tale of redemption, of seeking a fresh start, and they welcomed him with open arms, providing him with the help he needed to survive. To them, he was just another soul in need of salvation, but to law enforcement, he was a fugitive on the run. While Lees played his role perfectly, living under the radar, the investigation into Megan Rose's death continued to churn quietly beneath the surface. The Queensland Police, never giving up on their pursuit, had been working relentlessly to track down their prime suspect. They knew that the truth would only be revealed once Lees was found and brought to justice. And when they finally caught up with him, it was like the pieces of a long unsolved puzzle were finally falling into place. His arrest was a major turning point in the case, and as he was taken into custody, the first questions about his involvement in Megan's death began to surface. Lees was extradited back to Queensland, where he would face the full force of the law. The process of extradition was not an easy one. It required careful coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies, and at times, it seemed like the arrest would never come. But once the arrest was made, the authorities worked quickly to ensure he would face justice in the state where his crimes had occurred. When Lees was officially charged, the gravity of the situation became clear. He was not merely being accused of evading authorities. He was now facing charges for the murder of Megan Louise Rose, a crime he had long evaded responsibility for. The charges against him were significant, and as the case moved forward, the question on everyone's mind was simple. How would he respond to these allegations? Would he remain silent, or would he finally speak and offer an explanation for the events that had unfolded all those years ago? As Lees was brought before the Maroochydore Magistrates Court, the reality of the situation set in. He did not apply for bail, instead being remanded in custody as the legal proceedings moved forward. The case was adjourned, and the anticipation surrounding the upcoming trial was palpable. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the moment when the truth about Megan Rose's death would finally come to light. But even as Lees sat in custody, the questions surrounding his role in Megan's death grew more intense. Was he truly responsible for her death, or was there something more to the story than anyone realized? The trial, set for later in 2025, promised to reveal more details about the events of that fateful day at Point Cartwright. But for now, Keith Lees was in custody, his fate hanging in the balance as the world watched, waiting for justice to be served. What do you think of Keith Lee's arrest? How do you feel about the religious groups that unknowingly supported him during his time on the run? And what are your thoughts on the upcoming trial? Could there be more to this case than meets the eye? I want to hear your opinions. After the dramatic arrest of Keith Lees, the wheels of justice began to turn swiftly. His appearance in the Maroochydore Magistrates Court was a pivotal moment in the case, one that would set the stage for the legal battle that lay ahead. The court proceedings in the weeks that followed were watched with intense scrutiny, as the public and Megan Rose's family waited for answers. On January 2, 2025, when Keith Lees was extradited to Queensland and brought before the Maroochydore Magistrates Court, the magnitude of the situation became clear. The room was filled with tension as the 72-year-old man, now facing charges of murder, stood before the magistrate. Lees, who had spent 18 months on the run, had finally been brought to justice for the death of Megan Louise Rose, a death that had haunted the community for over 2 decades. As the charges were read aloud, the courtroom was filled with a heavy sense of anticipation. Keith Lees was officially charged with the murder of Megan Rose, a crime he had evaded for years. The gravity of these charges was undeniable, and the case quickly became one of the most high-profile in recent history. With the death of a young woman at the hands of someone she once trusted, the community's thirst for justice had never been stronger. In the face of these serious allegations, Lees did not apply for bail. The decision to deny bail was not surprising given the nature of the charges and the fact that Lees had been on the run for so long. He was remanded in custody, meaning he would remain behind bars until further court proceedings. This decision was crucial, as it ensured that he would not have the opportunity to flee again, keeping him under the watchful eye of the authorities until his trial began. However, as significant as this initial court appearance was, it was merely the beginning of a long and complex legal journey. The case was adjourned until April 28, 2025, which meant there would be months of waiting before any substantial progress was made in the courtroom. This delay allowed both the defense and the prosecution time to prepare for the trial, gathering evidence, organizing witnesses, and constructing their respective arguments. But what could we expect in the months leading up to that trial? What legal strategies might be employed by both sides as they prepared for what promised to be a highly contested and dramatic legal battle? For the prosecution, the case against Keith Lees seemed straightforward. With new forensic evidence, witness testimonies, and the fact that he had been evading capture for almost 2 years, they had a strong argument to make. Their job would be to prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Lees was responsible for Megan's death. But given the complexity of the case, the prosecution would have to address any potential defenses that might arise. They would need to solidify the timeline of Megan's final days, the nature of her relationship with Lees, and most importantly, the reasons why she was found dead at the base of the cliffs. On the other hand, Lee's defense team would undoubtedly attempt to raise doubts about his involvement in Megan's death. With his age and the lengthy time since the alleged crime, the defense might try to argue that there were other factors at play, possibly suggesting that there had been a mix-up in the evidence or that Megan's death was, in fact, a tragic accident. They could try to challenge the new forensic evidence, claiming that it wasn't conclusive enough to prove his guilt. And then there was the matter of Lee's past, how his character and history could be painted in a way that potentially mitigated the severity of the charges against him. With such high stakes, the trial was expected to be both emotionally and legally charged. The court would hear about Megan's life, her dreams, and the tragic circumstances surrounding her death. The impact on her family would be impossible to ignore, and the emotional weight of the case would be felt throughout the trial. For them, this was more than just a legal battle. It was about finding closure and justice for a beloved family member who had been lost too soon. As for Lees, his own fate hung in the balance. Would he be convicted of murder, or would the defense manage to cast enough doubt to secure an acquittal? The outcome of the trial could hinge on the smallest details, and every piece of evidence would be examined under a microscope. While the case may be adjourned for now, the months leading up to the trial were filled with questions and anticipation. What new revelations would emerge as both sides prepared their cases? What would the defense argue in the face of such damning evidence? And, perhaps most importantly, would justice be served for Megan Louise Rose and her family after so many years of uncertainty? As we wait for the trial to commence, I want to hear your thoughts. Do you think the prosecution has enough evidence to secure a conviction? What strategies do you think the defense might use to try and avoid a guilty verdict? The breakthrough in Megan Louise Rose's case after 27 years was nothing short of life-changing for her family. For decades, they had fought against the belief that her death was a suicide, always feeling deep down that something more sinister had occurred. When the Queensland Police Cold Case Unit finally reopened the investigation, their hopes were reignited. The arrest of Keith Lees brought a sense of relief. Finally, they were going to get the justice they had long been denied. Megan's family, including her parents and siblings, had carried the weight of unanswered questions for all these years. The emotional toll of never knowing the truth about her death had been unbearable. The closure they had been yearning for was now within reach. They were overwhelmed by a mix of emotions, grief for the daughter and sister they had lost, and relief that the person responsible for her death would finally be held accountable. The community of Mooloolaba, where Megan had once lived and worked, was also deeply affected. While Megan's family struggled with their grief, the community rallied around them, supporting the quest for justice. The case had remained an unsolved mystery for so long that its reopening rekindled feelings of uncertainty and disbelief among those who had once known her. Yet, the developments also sparked conversations about the importance of revisiting cold cases, especially those that had long been closed and forgotten. This case highlighted the crucial role of law enforcement in seeking justice, even when it seemed like the trail had run cold. It also underscored the need for persistence, as new technologies and methods can sometimes unveil the truth when it seems hopeless. The impact of revisiting such cold cases cannot be overstated, as they bring fresh hope to families who may have thought their loved ones would never get justice. As we reflect on Megan's case, we are reminded of the toll that delayed justice can take on families and communities. The years of unanswered questions, the emotional burden of loss without closure, these are scars that cannot be easily healed. For Megan's family, the pursuit of justice continues, but the breakthrough has given them something they had long lost: hope. What are your thoughts on the impact of cold case reopenings? How do you think the community's support can help families like Megan's during such painful times? In this case, we've seen a tragic story of a young woman, Megan Louise Rose, whose death remained a mystery for 27 years. Initially ruled a suicide, her case was finally reclassified as a homicide, leading to the dramatic arrest of her former partner, Keith Lees. After years of unanswered questions, her family and community now have hope for justice. The reopening of this cold case reminds us of the importance of never giving up, no matter how long it takes. It also highlights the impact such investigations have on families and the communities that are left searching for answers. Now, I want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you believe the justice system can truly offer closure after so many years? If you have any information or insights about the case, share them in the comments below. Let's keep the discussion going about the importance of pursuing justice, even when it seems impossible. If you found this story compelling, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more in-depth true crime content. Thank you for watching.